Now, let's talk a little bit about philosophy. So the class is Philosophy 242, right? Even though it is not a general philosophy, but I do want to give you some idea about philosophy in general. Because before we go into more specific questions, such as ethical questions, you do want to know, what is philosophy? Most of you guys, again, probably never took Philosophy 101. Did anybody take Philosophy 101? Okay. Again, like one person, right? So for those of you who didn't, you may want to know a little bit. Let's talk about it. So philosophy comes, the word philosophy comes from ancient Greek. And we will talk a lot about ancient Greece in this class. I love ancient Greece. I specialized on Aristotle. I know a lot about them. So the word itself comes from two Greek words, philia, which means love, and sophia, which means wisdom. Love of wisdom. Now, it is not just the pursuit of wisdom, though, because you may say, well, if I'm just sitting in my chair and wondering about things, isn't it already philosophy? No, because one thing people realized very early on, you have to do it rationally and systematically. You have to be able to use certain rules, the rules of logic, which is where logic began, which is why logic today are all philosophy classes, right? If you want to take logic at UNLV, you'll be taking, there's Philosophy 114, which is symbolic logic. There is 400 level logic class. There's several other specialized logic. Critical thinking also has a lot of logic involved. This is why. It started with philosophy. It started with ancient Greeks, and we still are using it. And today we're using it a lot for computer sciences. But originally, that was more about the words, about arguments in particular, and how you use your reason to present good arguments. Now, these are the main branches of philosophy: epistemology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, and there are several smaller specialized branches. So let's talk about them now so you would have some awareness. Some of you probably know about it already. First of all, let's talk about epistemology. That is a theory of truth and knowledge. What kind of questions epistemology asks? First of all, what is truth? Now, most people may think, wow, this is so simple, right? Isn't it easy? Like, is it true that there's a bottle on this table right now? You would say true. Why is it true? Because it corresponds to the fact of the bottle being on the table. Well, philosophers are annoying people. They started asking a lot of questions about it. One of them is, how sure are you there is a bottle on this table? Have you ever been dreaming and saw a bottle on tables, and then you wake up and turned out there's actually no tables, no bottles, you were sleeping? Are you sure you're not sleeping right now? You may say, well, I'm pretty sure, right? Okay, have you seen the movie The Matrix? If not, I recommend this movie very highly. It's based on this philosophical idea. How sure are you that you are actually sitting in a classroom and not being fed all this information right into your brain by some evil agents, as they did in The Matrix? People in The Matrix also thought they live in the real world, but the world was not real. Until you offered this red and blue pill by somebody, how would you ever know? Suppose we are in a matrix, so there's no bottle, there's no table, you're just swimming in this capsula with the wires attached to your brain. It's not too difficult to imagine now. They already have the technology which comes pretty close to it, right? There are deaf people who have things inserted into their brain who can hear. So how do you know they didn't just tie you up, inserted stuff into your brain, and just feeding this entire fake world right into it? If you're honest, you must answer, I actually cannot be 100% sure. I'm 99.99999% sure this is real world and this is real bottle, but I'm not 100% sure. Because I can't. How can I? Nobody offered me a red and blue pill. I don't know. So that's one of the problems with the truth. What exactly is the truth, and how do we know something is true? It's not a simple question. Epistemology spends a lot of time working on that. We're not going to go into this in this class because this is not so much about epistemology, but it is still interesting. Every now and then we may mention it. There's also a question, what is knowledge? When you say, I know something, what exactly do you mean? Let's say I tell you, I have a belief that there are 10 students in a classroom right next. Do I know it? Why? Why would you say I don't know it? I have a belief. It's a very strong belief. Very, very strong one. Some people have very strong beliefs, but they don't have knowledge. Why? Well, there are 3 criteria, and it's actually something Plato discusses in one of the dialogues, which we should read for this class too, I think. 3 criteria. First of all, you should have a belief. Right? That's the first requirement to have knowledge. You have to have a belief in the first place. Well, I do have a belief. Great. The second requirement, belief must be true. If it's not true, it's not knowledge. So without going back to whether something is true, most people would agree. What does it mean for it to be true that there are 10 students? How do you know if it's true? Well, if there actually are 10 students, then it is true, right? If it corresponds to this fact. But there is a third requirement, justification. Because, as Plato rightfully pointed out, it could be true by coincidence. I have this belief, I have no justification. I just have a belief there are 10, and there actually are 10. What do you know? Is it impossible? Can there not be 10 students in this classroom? Of course it's possible, right? Probably not 10. It seems kind of like a huge coincidence for there to be 10, but it's possible. And even then it would not be knowledge because I have no justification. Why do I have this belief? What is it based on? I just came up with this belief from nothing. Of course, what could be a justification? That's another interesting question which epistemology looks at. How can I justify this belief? So that's one way, right? I could go there myself right now and count them and come back to you and say, yes, there are 10. I have this belief. It is true. And justification is I counted them myself just now. But there are other ways, right? What else can I do? Well, yeah, you can try to just, again, use some sort of reasoning about what's the average number of students in a classroom, what would I expect there to be, and then take a guess based on this kind of information. But there's also other ways. For example, I could send one of you guys. I could say, could you please go and check? Could you count and come back and tell me? But then what could go wrong? A lie. That is one possibility. You could lie. People lie. Shockingly. They actually do. Why? Why do people lie? Well, you could have some sort of motive to lie. Now, the way we told this story so far, it doesn't seem like you would have a motive. You don't care. But let's make it more interesting. Let's say I'm considering sending you guys home. And I'm telling you, well, I don't know, but other classes, what are other professors doing? Are there people there? Could you please go check? And you go there and the class is packed. And then you're thinking, if I tell professor this, he will never send us home. And I want to go home. So how about I stretch it a little bit and I say, yeah, there's nobody there. Right? So if you have a motive to lie, you may sometimes lie. Depends on the circumstances. Because, I mean, obviously, one problem could be I could just not believe you and go check. And if it's not true, then I would be pretty mad. Right? Also, there are ways around it. I could send several people. Like, could 2 of you go or 3 of you go? Then it's harder to collude. You may say, let's lie to the professor, and other students will say, no, I don't want to lie to the professor. And then, of course, it's impossible, because if you come back and you tell different story, that would be really weird, and then I will definitely go and check myself. Okay, but that just tells you something interesting too, because guess what? 99% of knowledge we have about the world is given by other people. Like, how many of you been to the moon? Nobody? Well, then how do you know it's not a chunk of cheese? It kind of looks like a chunk of cheese to me. Well, other people told you, right? They even have astronauts who've been there. But same problem as with sending people to another room. Do you believe them or not? You have to assess it somehow. You have to figure out, are they telling you the truth? Because many people say, no, those astronauts, this is all a scheme. They're just lying to us. They've never been to the moon. It's all fake pictures. They photoshopped it or whatever. Look at the flag. It's kind of flat, whatever. Right? So this is the problem with many things in life. Because, like I said, we don't know even basic things. Like, what did these politicians say? There are many videos now, but they're also using AI to alter them and so on. So it's becoming harder and harder to determine the truth. Epistemology is a very cool part of philosophy. There are specific classes on it. We're not going to go too deeply into it, but there'll be some of it for sure. Then there's metaphysics. Metaphysics is another respected part of philosophy. What exactly is metaphysics? Well, first of all, the name itself. Where does it come from? Aristotle wrote a number of books which were actually lost for a long time. They discovered it several hundred years after he died. And when they discovered it, they had no names. But one of them was about physics. Physika in Greek means the nature. It was describing the nature, kind of the way physics does today. Then there was another book which kind of tried to go deeper than that. It even talked about God. It talked about many issues which are not part of physics, and it kind of was going after the physics. And in Greek, metaphysika literally means after the physics. So the people who are naming this book named it Metaphysika. And since then, we call subjects which related to this metaphysical subjects, and we call it Metaphysika, theory of existence and reality. It looks at questions such as, why does something exist instead of nothing? Now, why would we be asking this? Shouldn't science tell us this? Or, if you're religious, shouldn't religion tell you this? Well, first of all, let's start with science. What does science say about it? Why does something exist instead of nothing? Conservation of matter, that's why something exists. But if there was nothing, why would you have conservation of matter? Let me even rephrase it. Well, we know Big Bang happened. Why did Big Bang happen? Well, science doesn't tell us anything about that. And you may say, well, fair enough. If science doesn't tell us, I don't care. But many people still care. They still want to know. They still wonder about it. And ancient Greeks were wondering about it when they had no science whatsoever. In fact, philosophy was science at the time. They were trying to figure out, where did the world come from? But they were trying to use it again using reason and logic. Because there were myths. Hesiod, Homer were passing on these myths from generation to generation about how the gods created the world. But there were first philosophers, people who actually said, yeah, I don't know, it sounds like a beautiful story, but it sounds kind of made up. So maybe we can figure it out using logic. And of course they were going in all sorts of weird directions, but nonetheless it did eventually give us science. What is the fundamental underlying nature of reality? That's another interesting metaphysical question. And again, we can, of course, go to science, no problemo. What does science tell us? What is underlying nature of reality? What is everything made of? If you go back to 19th century, they did, well, actually, they started doing it in the 17th century, right? They came back to the Greek theory, which Epicureans were using, that everything is made up of atoms, right? Atom, the smallest chunk. That's a Greek theory, and atomos in Greek means indivisible. That's literally what this theory said. There's a small chunks everything is made of, like little bricks, and they are indivisible. You cannot divide them any further. Why? Because it's a problem if you can divide them, because then there's a question, what's inside that and what's inside that? So they thought, okay, there are teeny tiny chunks, you can't divide them any longer. Now, can we divide them? Yeah. As physics find out, already I think at the beginning of the 20th century, we actually can split an atom. Turns out there's a bunch of stuff inside those atoms. There's a nucleus, right? And there are electrons circling the atoms. And the nucleus consists of protons and neutrons, right? So a lot of cool stuff. Okay. What's inside of them? Quarks inside, yeah, protons and neutrons. Although electrons, I don't think have quarks. Electrons are too tiny. Okay, what's inside of them? Has anybody watched Big Bang Theory? Too long ago. Nobody's watching it anymore. Sheldon was working. Sheldon is supposedly a big physicist. Was working on that theory. It's a string theory. Strings. The tiny little strings, depending on how they rotate, they could make up either one of the quarks or the electron. Rotation of the strings, different dimensions. It's complicated. It's not a physics class, but this is the idea. Okay, but you can see next question coming up. What's the next question? What are strings made of? Well, we don't even know there are strings. They built a huge collider in Switzerland, and they're trying to prove this theory for, I don't know, what is it now, 50 years? Long time, 40 years. It's very difficult to prove because it's so tiny, right? Even proving electrons was difficult. They proved that the electrons exist. Going beyond that, it's not impossible, but so far they have not been successful. Mathematically, it makes sense. Mathematics tells us that having those strings and having their rotation, and there even string theory suggests several additional space dimensions which we are not aware of, and even several additional time dimensions, which all kind of wrapped up in those strings. Very cool theory. If you take higher level physics, you'll probably talk more about it. But the way philosophy approaches it is they still go deeper right away, and they ask, okay, what are the strings made of? What is everything made of in the end of the day? We don't want to wait 1,000 years to find out. We can wonder about it today. Maybe we'll be wrong, but let's take a shot at it. Let's do our best. And this is what metaphysics goes over. It's not very popular recently. It's been having bad time for the last probably 100, 200 years because of science taking over, and everybody's like, metaphysics. However, some of these questions are very important for us too, such as, does God exist? Now, if you're religious, the answer is simple, right? How do you know that God exists if you're a Christian? Read the Bible, right? It's all right there. Case closed. But what if you are not religious? Don't you still wonder, does God exist? Some kind of God, maybe not Christian God, maybe not Muslim God, but some form of God. Metaphysics goes there and again uses reasoning to try to answer these questions. And they are important. Is it important for us whether God exists? Do you care? I mean, if we look at Christianity, what does Christianity tell us will happen to people after death? Huh? Yeah, the judgment. And God is going to judge you on everything you've done. So don't you think it's important to find out whether there's God and whether there will be judgment? I mean, I would like to know. Maybe I can't, but I would like to. If I can, I would certainly like to know, because that changes a lot of things. And that is why we wonder about it. And yeah, there are even some philosophers who are religious, and they still want to use the reason as a backup, I guess, to still go there and maybe prove the same things using reason. We will see Thomas Aquinas in this class. He is very influential. He was one of the philosophers, and also he was a very religious person. He is considered, in fact, an official theologian of the Catholic Church. Not for nothing. Okay, then there is logic, of course. The entire thing is built on logic because the rules which you use to try to answer all these questions are the same. This is the rules you learn in logic classes, and we will go a little bit over some of it next week. Just scratch the surface a little because the class is not about logic, but you can't help it. And the book also goes into it right away. In almost any book on any subject in philosophy goes into it, because you really can't start arguing about things unless you know how to argue. So for those of you who took Philosophy 102, you probably know already all this stuff much better, but we have to do at least a little bit, because critical thinking is satisfied, the requirement of critical thinking satisfied by this class, so certainly we have to at least touch it a little. And then there's ethics. Ethics is a theory of virtue and morality. It answers questions such as what actions are right or wrong? Are some actions inherently right or wrong, or are actions right or wrong based on their consequences? In other words, are there certain things we just shouldn't do, like murder, regardless of the consequences of murder? Like, I'm sure there are some people who you think, wouldn't it be nice if somebody murdered them? But still, the question is, should we ever murder anybody or not? And if not, why not? We will look at it more deeply. And ancient Greeks were asking this question too. Like, if you can, well, today, what is the most obvious question? Well, first of all, for a religious person, why you shouldn't murder? Well, if you're Christian, there is a commandment which says point blank, thou shalt not kill, right? It's in the Bible, so there's no if and but about it. And there's this judgment. So after death, you'll be judged on that. But what if you're not religious? Is it okay to kill them? Not everybody is religious. Some people say, I'm an atheist. So is it okay? Well, you may say there's law, right? You don't want to go to jail. Okay, but let's say you can get away with it. Let's say you can kill somebody and nobody would ever find out. Is it okay to do it then? Plato was wondering about that 2,400 years ago. We will read this and talk about it later. But of course, there are reasons, as you can imagine, why you may still not want to do it, even if nobody would ever find out about it. And you can imagine yourself those reasons. So what criteria should we use to determine whether action is right or wrong? For future scientists and engineers, this is a very important question too. If you're doing science, you are doing a lot of actions which may have a lot of consequences for this world, right? Some people developing AI, some people developing nuclear weapons, biology and so on, some sort of biological weapons. Some people developing stuff which is not weapons but could be turned into weapons or could be used in some other horrible ways. So is this okay to do anything as long as you get paid, or are there limits? And what are those limits? This is the most important questions. In fact, Stoics actually compared philosophy to the garden, right? They said the entire philosophy is like a garden. First of all, logic is like a fence. The fence which surrounds the garden. It guards it, kind of holds the bad people away. Physics is the land and the trees in this land. Guess what they thought ethics is? The fruit on those trees. The most important part. Right? The fruit, what you actually have a garden for. And the same thing here. Like, this is the questions we all deal with throughout our life. How do you live your life? What do you do? How do you approach all these things? There's things happening every day. You're voting in elections, you're going to protests, you're arguing with your parents, I don't know what. All of this. Is it right? Is it wrong? What should you do? Should you do it? Should you not do it? How should you do it? This is the most important questions. In the end of the day, they'll determine how your life proceeds. They'll determine how it ends, for many cases. And when it ends, it'll be too late to change anything, so now we still have time. Let's try to figure it out. And there are some these specialized branches, like I said. So you can also have special courses in philosophy of language, philosophy of law, philosophy of science. There's a separate philosophy of science, political philosophy. In fact, if you ever major in philosophy, you would have to take, if not all of them, then at least many of them, and they are taught here at UNLV by different professors. Very interesting, especially stuff like political philosophy. We will also talk a little bit about it, especially since Aristotle actually thought political philosophy more important than ethics. Ethics is secondary to political philosophy and kind of helps us to understand it. Why? Because politics obviously affects us all immediately, and ethics is clearly very closely connected to that. Should politics be ethical? Should politicians be ethical? What standards should we have to judge them? Should we judge them at all? Or is it okay for them to do anything they want. So all of these are connected questions between political philosophy and ethics. Okay, so this is the brief definition of philosophy we can give at this point. It is the human attempt to systematically study the most fundamental structures of the entire experience in order to arrive at beliefs that are conceptually clear, experimentally confirmed, and rationally coherent as possible. Right? So this is the three criteria which typically has to be satisfied: conceptual clarity, experimental confirmation, and rational coherence. What does it mean? Well, first of all, you should be conceptually clear. If you're thinking about something, that's why Aristotle came up with definitions. Why do you need a definition? You have to be clear about what are you talking about. If you're saying, if your question is, does God exist? Well, what do you mean by God? Do you mean like a grandpa with a beard? Do you mean some sort of abstraction? What is God? Depending on that, your answer may be very different. Then it should be experimentally confirmed. We don't do experiments in philosophy, but there is one experiment we're all running, our own life. Right? So if your philosophical theory is bad and you apply it to yourself and you live your life according to it and your life sucks, then of course it's not a good theory, is it? On the other hand, if your life is more fulfilling, if you feel better, then something is going wrong right here. And finally, it should be rationally coherent. So if you have a number of beliefs and ideas in your philosophy, the whole thing should make sense. One part should work with another. If you have beliefs which are contradictory and can't work together, then there is a problem too. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about Socrates, because the first reading we will do for next week is Socrates. He's a main character in it. It's written by Plato. Socrates himself never wrote anything, but he is a very, very interesting figure. And when we talk about Plato, he constantly talks about Socrates, so it is useful to know a few things. Also, it will serve as a background information for this reading. Who was Socrates? What was going on with him? So this is the sculpture from a museum. It actually is, I think, a copy of the original Greek, but it does show you Socrates the way he kind of looked. And this is also confirming to what we know about him. He had the snub nose. He was not pretty by Greek standards. Greeks preferred longer noses. And he was walking around Athens, barefoot, poorly dressed, and he was very annoying. He was approaching a variety of different people, asking them questions, questioning them. Right? But young people loved it. They really enjoyed the show. They were following him. He had a whole bunch of young people following him, including Plato, who will later be writing about Socrates, his teacher. Why did they do that? Because Socrates was questioning important people of the city. He was asking them questions such as, what is justice? What is honor? What is courage? And they, of course, frequently answered, like, Your Honor, you're a judge, you're a man of law. Can I please know, could you tell me, what is justice? And the judge would say, oh, that's easy, and give an answer. And then Socrates would continue questioning him, which is today we call dialectical method, right? Continue asking additional questions like, okay, this is very fine, but here's a little problem I have. Could you explain this? And eventually, that person would see that he looks like a fool. Why? Because he contradicts himself. And it was always a he, because in ancient Greece, there were not many women who held important positions or whatever. Anyway, so as a result, those young people would love it, but what do you think the important people themselves felt? Were they happy about it? No, they hated it. They were absolutely not happy about it, and that is what resulted in Socrates being put on trial. The time period itself is very interesting too. It was what we call today golden age of Greece. Golden Age. Why is it Golden Age? Because the Greek achievement, the ancient Greek achievements during the 5th century BC are amazing. For one thing, they had democracy. Democracy itself is a Greek word. I don't know if you guys know. Demos, kratos, power of the people, is Greek words, and it originated in Athens. This is one of the things they decided the best way to govern, although their democracy was a little different. They did not have the same democracy as we have. Their democracy was direct. Direct democracy means people decide the questions together. And some of the questions they literally decided together, which is also why at some point democracy didn't do as well. One of the things which really kind of made them sour about democracy, there was an important question whether they should invade Sicily, whether they should send a fleet to Sicily. And they gathered, and to them it was easier because Athens had about 10,000 people population. It was a city and a state, but it was not the state in our sense of the word. So you can actually gather several thousand people in a square and have them decide the question. Right? Here it's impossible. Right? We cannot gather 320 million Americans anywhere and have them all decide something. We can only do it via some sort of media. But they could. So they decided to invade Sicily because some of the speeches they heard were very persuasive. And when they invaded Sicily, it went really badly for the Greek fleet. It was a disaster. And they were like, ooh, maybe democracy is not that great after all. Maybe we should let generals decide questions like this. Generals, after all, have been spending their entire life fighting. So they know a little bit more about it than all of us. Which is also, you will see Socrates, the way Socrates argues. But other than that, it was Golden Age. The poetry, everything was flourishing. And in the same time, they had this huge problem with moral disintegration. This is a quote from Thucydides. He says, "The common meaning of words was turned about at man's pleasure. The most reckless bravado was deemed the most desirable friend. A man of prudence and moderation was styled a coward. A man who listened to reason was a good-for-nothing simpleton." What are the reasons for this? Well, there are several reasons. One of them is respect for the cultural authorities. This poetic tradition of Homer and Hesiod has declined substantially. They were questioning their poets. Philosophers were coming up with different theories. But the problem with that was that there were many philosophers and they had many theories. And the simple folks, when they were listening to this, were going, okay, this philosopher says this, and that philosopher says that, and that philosopher says the third thing. So they don't know anything. This is all nonsense. Another thing is increased contact with different cultures. Because at the time, the Greeks started traveling a lot. They go into Babylon and Egypt and all sorts of other parts of the world. And then they discovered that these people have their own customs. They live differently. Things which Greeks thought is the way things should be done, they do in a completely different way. So then the obvious question becomes, what's the right way to do things? If you do it this way, and another culture does it another way, and a third culture does it their own way, is there even one way to do things? Or maybe there's no way. Maybe it's just whatever. Right? So that's to kind of undermine their traditional culture. The rise of democratic lawmaking, I already said, the democracy, they had problems with democracy. At one point, they will even have tyranny. They will have several tyrants, and not for a long time, but that was kind of an outcome of this decline in trust in democracy. And then plurality of opinion amongst philosophers, I already also mentioned. There was a trial. They put him to trial in 399 BC. They got a huge juries, 500 people, and the charge was that Socrates is guilty of corrupting the youth, believing not in the gods whom the state believes in, but in other new divinities. That was the charge. Why did they charge him with corrupting the youth? Well, the young people were following him. They were observing how he was making fools out of all the important people in the city. So that was the charge. there is whole dialogue, apology, which is about this trial, where Plato describes what was happening. We're not going to read this dialogue, but the credo actually takes place right after that, because, well, actually, guess what? He was sentenced to death. The jury, by 280 votes to 220 votes, decided that he should die. And the dialogue which you will read takes place right after that, when Socrates is in prison. So make sure to read it, it's already there, and we will continue on Monday. Hope to see you all. If you have any questions, let me know.